This strange story that happened in 2008 has been covered by the media in many countries of the world, no matter what versions were promoted, from hypnosis and testing of unknown drugs to the participation of intelligence with poison gas. But of course, the main thing was called a mystical spiritual connection between the twins, a karmic connection, which scientists have yet to discover and explain. For society, this story began in the first half of the day, May 17, 2008. The Birmingham Road Service inspectors, who tracked the footage transmitted by road cameras on the monitors from London streets, unexpectedly noticed two women wandering along the central dividing line on the suburban M6 highway. Police patrols were sent to the scene of the violation of the law, one of which was followed by a filming crew of a daily morning show. Having gone to the place where two women were walking right in the middle of the busy highway, police journalists at first thought that they would face a common situation. The women would turn out to be either eccentric individuals, drunkards, or addicts who had lost their time and space. This incident did not seem to be at risk, and everyone thought that this story would soon be forgotten. Who would have thought that she would get the most terrible sequel? While the car with the patrols and journalists followed the point of the incident, a radio message came that one of the female violators from the separate lane went out onto the road, where she was hit by a car. The severity of her injuries was not known to anyone, but the participants in these events began to come to their senses. The story began to complicate and already had sad consequences. When the reporters arrived at the scene, they saw that other patrol cars, which had arrived a little earlier, were already talking to the strange women on the side of the road. They were already being talked to by other patrol cars, which had arrived a little earlier. At the same time, both violators seemed safe, and the report that one of them was driving under the wheels of the car looked like a mistake. Only later did it turn out that the woman had already been hit by a car on the roadway. But, fortunately, she was not injured. The twin sisters looked quite normal. They did not stagger, did not scream, and listened carefully to the patrolman who spoke to them, only occasionally looking around. The journalists began to film the officer, who explained the incident to the camera. And suddenly something happened that was hard to believe, even seeing it with your own eyes. One of Ursula's sisters, abruptly throwing her bag on the asphalt, threw herself on the road, where a huge truck was just passing by. The lightning-fast reaction of the patrolman, who tried to stop her while holding her hand in a jacket, was unsuccessful. The woman, clearly in a mentally abnormal state, acquired a mad acceleration and just threw her clothes off together with the policeman who clung to her. She did not want to be saved, but she decided that she would not die in a crushed, heavy machine, so she bent over and dove right under the wheels of the transport. The truck driver, although he managed to react quickly, could not stop the truck from moving in inertia for a moment. On the legs of Ursula Erickson, several wheels of the trailer drove instantly, breaking her lower limbs. The woman only once screamed like a wounded seagull and stopped motionless on the road. Stunned by what she saw, all the participants in the event rushed to her aid. At this moment, attention to the second sister, Sabine Erickson, who remained on the side of the road, was weakened for just a second, and she immediately took advantage of it. Following her sister, she also ran out onto the road, where, in just a second, she was already flying up, thrown like a doll, in a frontal collision with a Volkswagen Polo. It was hard to believe the reality of what was happening. At a distance of 3 meters from each other, on the road lay like 2 drops of water, similar to a woman, for some reason wishing to die at such an early age. Both of them, despite the severe injury, were alive and conscious. Ursula Erickson's eyes were open, and the pelvis and both legs were broken, so the bones tore the pants and trousers. Sabine was lying on her back, battered by a powerful blow to the body against the car, from which the windshield broke in the car and the roof was seriously damaged. None of the women said a word and almost did not moan with pain, and when they came to their senses, they both tried to get up on their feet, despite the injuries. They did not listen to anyone's persuasions and requests not to move before the ambulance arrived, and on the contrary, they suddenly began to swear, desperately spit, scratch, and fight off the patrolmen, as if they were their worst enemies. The movement to one side of the highway had to be stopped, and an ambulance was called for the evacuees. At that moment, everyone who witnessed this strange incident was convinced that Ursula and Sabine Erickson were clearly under the influence of some heavy drugs. Only in this way could Dick explain that he was convinced that Ursula and Sabine Erickson were clearly under the influence of some heavy drugs. Only in this way could it be explained the wild behavior of both victims, their almost complete absence of pain, and their incredible aggression towards the guards of order. The sisters had a strange reaction to what was happening. It seemed that they did not understand where they were or what happened. They constantly looked around, called the police, looked as if they were on patrol, and tried to break out of their hands. Suddenly, Sabina, pushing the woman policeman who was holding her on the ground, got up on her feet. It is not clear what force moved her, but it seems that the victim of the accident did not physically feel anything but was afraid of someone, believing that she needed to urgently run away from here. After the car crash, the woman should have at least experienced shock and felt pain all over her body, but the victim was as if nothing had happened, demonstrating inhuman endurance. With an invisible force, she began to move somewhere to the side and wanted to run away. Of course, the policeman's wife couldn't let her go and began to grab her by the hands, trying to calm her down and convince her to stop. And then Sabina, turning her whole body, pushed the tired patrol woman with all her might, although she was clearly 15 kilograms heavier, and threw her on the asphalt. And she, like a special forces officer, made a smart jump over 2 metal bumpers and again ran to the open part of the highway. The policeman who rushed after her tried to calm her down with words, but Sabina dropped her coat, got up, and prepared to fight. Here, already in the situation, she had to interfere with other guards of order. The driver who was watching all this came to the rescue. As a result, at 7, Sabina was hardly twisted and stuffed into a police car. All this time, she was loudly swearing and fighting fiercely, as if she were in the paws of a zombie. It felt like this fight was a way for her to stay alive, there was no other way. And for some reason, she constantly called the police and told the policeman, "I recognize you, you are not a real policeman," although there were several policemen around her who repeatedly showed her their badges. At this time, Ursula was also in an aggressive state, constantly trying to fight the doctors who arrived at the emergency room. She bit their hands, aimed, and spat right in the face, uttering the most disgusting swears. In order to calm the patient, who was in urgent need of immediate medical attention, she was injected with a strong dose of sedative, and only after she calmed down was the helicopter loaded. By this moment, everyone was finally convinced that Ursula's twin sisters, Sabine and Erickson, were inflamed with something hallucinogenic. Both women were taken by helicopter to the nearest hospital. Ursula had surgery. She had a torn spleen, a broken spine, a pelvis, and both legs in several places. But Sabina's doctors did not find any serious injuries and handed them over to the police. By this time, and since the accident on the road had already passed about 5 hours, Sabina had noticeably calmed down and cheered up. There was no trace of her violence. She no longer behaved aggressively and reacted to questions, but she simply did not give many answers and did not try to fight and run away. In a word, she behaved normally and adequately. Therefore, the police who came to her were very surprised at first. After they were told what kind of ward they would have to lead, the policemen expected to see a real devil in the flesh. But a fragile, quiet blonde, obediently following the police car, came out of the hospital in a robe. Therefore, putting her in the back seat, no one chained Sabina to the handcuffs. Upon arrival at the site, she spoke about the weather, laughed, joked, and even flirted with the police. She let herself be examined and searched. It seemed to the outsider that this could not be the same Sabine Erickson, who a few hours ago was more like a furious fury, ready to tear anyone who touched her. And since she communicated with completely different police, not those who tried to calm her down on the road, soon everyone began to treat her calmly and normally. These police officers did not see what Sabina was doing on the road. They did not fight back with her hands, did not wipe their faces from spit, did not see her car body broken, did not hear swearing, and did not try to hold back. All this was somewhere in the reports of tired colleagues and on the screens of the morning show, which these police officers on duty could not see. They tried to talk to her, but Sabina, for some strange reason, forgot everything that was happening to her. She was not interested in the fate of her sister and did not ask anyone about her, but constantly looked at her reflection, worried about whether she looked good, and sought her clothes and jewelry. She continued to joke, and on questions about the causes of her behavior, she answered either in silence or with a phrase "I don't remember." She said that she never in her life wanted to hurt herself or other people. As a result, the interrogation did not explain anything. Later, the results of the tests showed that both Erickson's sisters were clean of drugs or alcohol. Sabina's family also did not find anything, and the police did not find any evidence that the sisters ever took or bought heavy stimulants. Sabine was charged with attacking policemen and creating an emergency, while Ursula was obviously spared, and she avoided responsibility. But the call to her husband was a shock to the policeman. He had no idea where his wife was or what had happened to her, and most importantly, he wasn't really interested in the violations she committed. However, the real surprise for the detectives who took up the case with the twin sister, Erickson, was still ahead. On the day of the Sabina incident, the psychiatrists came to the conclusion that, whatever her condition on the M6 highway, the woman's mental reactions were now normal. She understood where she was and who was next to her, adequately assessed herself, time, and space, and most importantly, was in a state of stability and did not pose a threat to herself or others. It was hard to believe, but her madness turned out to be temporary. And now there was no reason to diagnose and put Sabina in a psychiatric clinic, and therefore Sabina was kept under guard for a short time before the trial. On the morning of May 19, 2008, a trial was held on her case. The woman was found guilty. She fully admitted her guilt over the attack on the police officer and the accident on the road. The court sentenced her to 1 day in prison, which the defendant had already served in the preliminary detention cell. Sabina Erickson was released, forgetting that this woman had deliberately thrown herself under the wheels of a car a few days ago and, enraged, rushed to the guards of order. And although no one ever realized that a temporary intervention with her happened on the road, everyone thought that this state had passed irrevocably, which means that it can go in all 4 directions. Later, many people will regret this decision and will never understand what they did wrong. Sabina will go unknown. Her sister Ursula will normally undergo several operations, after which she will spend about 3 months in a psychiatric hospital, and at this time the detectives will add up the picture of what preceded the incident on the M6 highway. It turns out that the twins, Sabina and Ursula, were born on November 3, 1967, in the Swedish city of Sunne. They were not the only children. The twins had another older sister, Mona, and a brother, Bjorn. The twin sisters constantly maintained contact with each other and their loved ones, but for the first time in 8 years, they met on the eve of the road accident on May 16, 2008. On that day, Ursula flew from the United States to Sabine Mello and settled in her house, and the next day at 2 a.m. secretly, the sisters, guided by some of their ideas, got on a ferry going to Liverpool, England. Upon arrival, they purposefully began to look for the police department. In the subsequent interrogation or interview, the sisters will never explain why they left Ireland for England. According to police reports, around 8:30 a.m. on May 16, 2008, they came to the police station in Liverpool, where they reported that Sabina's children, who were living in Mello, were in danger. The story of both sisters was so confusing that they did not believe the words but tried to make sure that their statements were true. For these purposes, the police called the Dublin police, which was watching the law and order in the city of Mello, and found out that the night before, a number of police officers were called to the house of Sabine Erickson's neighbors. There were screams and sounds of an active family quarrel. It turned out that the spouses were not just arguing but seriously fighting. The spouses tried to calm down, warning about the consequences. The quarrel seemed to have subsided, and the police were on their own. But what happened next in this house is no longer known to anyone. Having listened to their colleagues from Dublin, the Liverpool police understood that they were dealing with an upset woman who had witnessed her husband's misconduct at home. It is more expensive to interfere in such matters, and therefore the woman was advised to calm down and return home to the children. But upon leaving the station, Erickson's sisters did not go home to Mello, and at 11:30, they somehow got on the National Express bus and went to London. Both had quite voluminous bags that were difficult to hold in their hands. The express driver immediately told the passengers that such cargo should be placed in the trunk of the bus. But the women, unwillingly holding their bags, abruptly refused to part with them. At first, the driver, a little grumbling, still let the sisters on the bus, but on the way, he began to watch them in the rearview mirror and soon saw their unusual behavior. Both sisters looked incredibly tense, constantly looking around, whispering, and looking as if they were up to something. And most importantly, they constantly pressed their bags to their chests, as if they were their main wealth or salvation from the death penalty. Arriving at the nearest technical service station on the intercity buses, she said that she had 2 women at the station, most likely with a bomb in their bags. But the police officers who arrived searched for the Erickson sisters but found nothing suspicious and considered this call a false alarm. Perhaps if they paid more attention to the mental state of the twins, they could interrupt the sequence of the next terrible events. But at that moment, their task was to prevent a possible terrorist attack and not look into the heads of strange citizens. Therefore, the sisters were released. And those who, for some reason, passionately wanted to get to London turned out to have no money. It is not known what was going on in their heads then, but probably the only way to get to the British capital, they saw a journey on foot along the dividing line of the M6 motorway, where at 15 to 20 of this day they were seen on the monitors by road inspectors. The rest is known to you, but this is far from the end of this fascinating story. Let's go back to Sabine, who, according to psychiatrists, police officers, and judges, returned to normal and no longer posed a threat to society. Upon leaving the court, she was ordered to go home to her husband and children, but the woman did not think to do this but began to wander around the city. In a thoughtful state, for some reason, dressed in the green cardigan of her sister, the one that Ursula had thrown herself before falling under the wheels of a truck, and holding in her bag the things given by the police. She wandered into one of the city parks, where she ran into two local men, 54-year-old Glenn and his friend Peter. They had just had a couple of glasses of Ellie's perfume at the bar, and now they were walking the dog and slowly, in a pleasant conversation, admiring the beauty of spring. Sabina, either feeling loneliness and detachment from her twin sister or, in a frenzy of madness, wanted to talk to someone. She stroked her dog and said something nice. After that, word for word, she started talking to men. Somehow, she told them her sad story, that her twin sister got into a car accident. She is now in the hospital, but Sabina doesn't know that she has no one here and there is no home. And her sister did not need to be found and visited. Tears rolled down her eyes. And the men, touched by the grief of others, wanted to help her. Glenn, a former military doctor, being a responsive and open person, offered Sabina to stay with him for a couple of days. He also assured the unfortunate woman that he would definitely help her find her sister. From that moment on, the fate of the good man was decided. About a day later, the stranger he offered his help to brutally killed him in his own house. The whole trinity came to Glenn's house around 8 p.m. At first, they just chatted and drank beer. Sabina looked very upset and tense and constantly talked about her sister. She sat in the chair, then jumped out of it, rushed up to the window, and tried to look out into the depths of the dark night, after which she tightly covered the curtains. She trembled and was desperately afraid, but she didn't explain why. Soon, her behavior began to look like a paranoid one. She refused to eat and drink, offered her cigarettes to men, and then knocked them out of her mouth, saying that they might have poison. Shortly before midnight, Peter got tired of the strange show, turned away, and left. What happened next between Glenn and Sabine? No one but the latter knows. It is only established that around noon the next day, Mr. Hollingshead called his brother Paul, who worked at the University Hospital in North Staffordshire, and told him about Sabine Erickson and her sister. He asked him for help in obtaining information about Ursula Erickson's whereabouts, but he understood that it would be difficult. Then a white spot appears in history again, during which no one knows what happened. On May 20, 1940, Glenn left home and, seeing his neighbor, Frank Boot, washing a minibus in a dead end, asked him for a couple of bags of tea. Having received what he wanted, he returned home, but only a minute later he appeared on the street again, already bleeding. I only managed to pronounce it. She hit me with a knife and fell dead on a bridge rocker. According to police documents, the ambulance arrived at the scene at about 8 p.m. But at the entrance to the victim's house, medical workers saw a woman standing on the road, or rather on the island, who was hitting herself with a hammer on her head. Later, it became clear that this woman was Sabine Erickson. A few minutes earlier, she stabbed Glenn right in his kitchen with 5 stab wounds, and now in a completely insane state, she was on the roadway of the A50 motorway, putting things on herself and threatening other people. Part of the medical staff rushed to check if the injured man was alive, and 2 ambulance paramedic officers ran to Sabine. At this time, one of the passing motorists, Joshua Grodich, slowed down in front of her. He jumped out of the car and tried to pick up the crazy hammer, but it again demonstrated unbearable agility and strength. He turned around, took a stone out of his pocket, and warmed up her supposed savior, knocking him down. The nurse, seeing such an absurd and at the same time terrifying development of events, instantly realized that in front of them was a dangerous patient who would be disfigured and isolated in any way. And although the task of the ambulance medical staff is usually not to pursue the madman, they rushed to Sabina to throw her on the ground. But she, like a fast beast, turned away and, at a furious speed, let her go straight down the motorway, causing a terrifying shock to the motorists. The chase lasted a few minutes. It soon became clear that the woman was moving towards a multi-level suspension, rising 12 meters above the roadside. In one jump, she jumped onto the railing of the bridge and, without thinking for a second, fell down. So ended one of the strangest and most incomprehensible street chases that Britain has seen. Sabine Erickson was also left alive this time. Her inexplicable, then appearing, then disappearing madness probably gave women the strength of movie superheroes. What for most people would end with death, for Sabine was only a fracture of both legs and head injuries. Placed in the hospital ward, she again began to demonstrate the highest normality. There was no trace of her aggression, delirium, or paranoia. She again began to demonstrate perfect normalcy in the hospital room. There was no trace of her aggression, delirium, or paranoia. Either she really did not remember anything about her actions or she was masterfully hiding them. In any case, as I mentioned earlier, she will not tell anyone anything later. On June 6, 2008, she was taken to court for her first hearing. The prosecution had a large list of claims against the defendant and a complete lack of explanation of her motives. The lawyer, Sabina, was in a bad situation. He absolutely did not know how to explain the actions of his client. So both sides came to a consensus pretty quickly. Despite the psychiatrist's verdict on the suitability of the defendants at the time, it is obvious that, at the time of the crime, both women were not in their right minds. What else could explain all that they did in a couple of days? With the opinion of lawyers, the prosecution will name the condition of Sabine Erickson at the time of the murder as an induced delirium disorder, which is formed in the mass psychosis, and will say that now, during the trial, she is perfectly healthy. The defense psychiatrist will say that at the time of the madness, Sabina clearly suffered from acute polymorphic psychotic disorder, the reason for which is also a mass psychosis. In the fall of 2009, the British court accused Sabina Erickson of many crimes, including the unintentional murder of Glenn Hollingshead. The woman admits her guilt but will claim that she does not remember anything, had no ill intentions, and did all this in a state of confusion of reason. Judge Justin Saunders will name the case of Sabine Erickson as the most difficult in her practice and say that her guilt for the crime is very low because she did not report her actions. He will also add, "I understand that my verdict and the relatives of the victim will not be able to satisfy me. Nevertheless, I am passing a verdict on the basis that the cause of the murder was a temporary mental illness and, therefore, the guilt of the defendant is not high." This decision is not intended to punish the defendant and does not reflect all the grief that the relatives of Mr. Hollingshead have experienced. The reason for all the actions of both twin sisters was called mass psychosis, as it is called in different languages. As a result, Sabine Erickson was sentenced to only 5 years in prison. The first victim of the madness between the two was Ursula. Sabine was infected with madness. The virus of interference led to the fact that the woman began to hear non-existent voices dictating strange actions to her. She suffered from erroneous judgments that she considered true. And, so to speak, the case of the twin sisters Sabina and Ursula Erickson is a case where the perpetrators could not do anything to avoid bad consequences. In September 2009, Sabina was sent to an ordinary women's prison, where she spent only 439 days, less than a year and a half, and then was released on amnesty. During all the time that she was behind bars, no one had ever seen signs of a mental disorder. Sabina and Ursula but Teresa fell mad in May 2008, and after that, as if nothing had happened, they never mentioned him. One of the sisters returned to live and work in the United States. The other continued to live with her husband and children in Ireland. None of them ever answered a single question about what happened to them in May 2008. Some people still believe that the system of criminal justice in the case of the Erickson sisters was in a terrible mess, not answering many questions and not calling the guilty to account. However, most of the women themselves tend to justify their actions, as they say about the syndrome of a mad dog. Allegedly, the sick animal is not guilty of its illness, but someone had to watch it, not allowing the hat to bite innocent people. So, the brother of the murdered Glenn Hollingshead, Harry, said, "I question the system of criminal justice for allowing Sabine Erickson to remain free and commit a serious crime. Her mental state should have been seen by someone on time, recognized, and cured. Only psychiatrists, according to him, use their hands. In the absence of any material diagnostic systems, it is impossible to recognize such a state with the naked eye." It is also curious that the older brother's sister, Erickson Bjorn, does not agree with the verdict of the court at the moment, but for a different reason than the brother of the victim. In his opinion, Ursula and Sabina did not fall into a state of temporary insanity in May 2008, but in fact were hiding from real danger. He claims that the women were running from a certain maniac who, in fact, threatened them. That is why, preferring to die rather than be raped or killed, they decided to get under the car. To this day, the story of the strange madness of the twin sisters, Ursula and Sabine Erickson, remains a big mystery. I recommend watching other interesting and no less shocking stories. Click right now. See you soon.